It was a crisp autumn morning when the call came through. Fred Baker was sitting on his back porch, the early sunlight filtering through the maple trees that stood tall in his yard. The air was cool, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and freshly brewed coffee. Fred had been retired from the military for a few years by then, but his body still woke up at 5 o'clock a.m. sharp, a habit forged over 2 decades of service. He sat with his hands wrapped around a steaming mug, his gaze fixed on the tree line beyond his backyard fence. It was quiet, almost too quiet, the kind of quiet that only a seasoned operator would notice. Fred Baker was a man shaped by discipline and duty. He had spent 20 years in the United States Air Force, serving in the elite 24th Special Tactics Squadron, a Tier 1 unit so secretive that most people outside the military had never heard of it. His job had been intense combat control, coordinating air and ground forces under the most dangerous conditions imaginable. He had operated behind enemy lines, directed airstrikes, and orchestrated missions that were classified at the highest levels of government. His work had taken him to Afghanistan, Iraq, and a dozen other places he wasn't allowed to name. But now, life was quieter. He had traded night raids and fire support for tending to his garden and watching the sun rise. Or at least that's what he had thought, until that phone call. The ringtone cut through the morning stillness, vibrating against the wooden slats of the porch table. Fred set down his coffee and answered, his voice steady despite the sinking feeling in his gut. On the other end of the line was Jake Barber, an old friend and fellow veteran, and Jake's tone was serious. "Fred," Jake said, "we need to talk. Face to face, V." Fred didn't ask questions. He just nodded and said, "I'll be there." That's how it was in the Tier 1 community. When someone called, you showed up, no hesitation, no excuses. 2 hours later, Fred was driving his Ford F-150 down a winding country road, the crisp autumn wind streaming through the open window. The meeting spot was a small, nondescript cabin deep in the woods, the kind of place you'd miss unless you were looking for it. Jake was waiting on the porch, his expression tight, his eyes shaded beneath the brim of a worn ball cap. Fred stepped out of the truck and gave him a long look. Jake had the look of a man carrying a heavy burden, and not just the physical kind. His face was leaner than Fred remembered, and his eyes were shadowed with exhaustion. Fred had seen that look before. It was the look of a man who had seen too much and couldn't talk about it. They shook hands, firm and wordless, before stepping inside the cabin. Jake shut the door behind them and pulled the blinds. The room was dimly lit, the air thick with tension. Jake poured them both a drink whiskey, neat, and sat down at the scarred wooden table in the center of the room. Fred took the seat opposite him and waited. "I need you to listen," Jake said, his voice low. "And I need you to keep an open mind." Fred arched a brow. "When have I not?" Jake took a breath. "You know about the crash retrieval program?" Fred's jaw tightened. Of course, he'd heard whispers over the years, rumors about classified government programs dedicated to recovering downed objects, unidentified objects. But they were just stories, the kind of things you heard in the barracks late at night after too many beers. "Go on," Fred said. Jake's gaze sharpened. "It's real, Fred, and it's bigger than you think." Fred didn't flinch, but his pulse quickened. He had spent his career in special operations. He had seen things that didn't make sense. Aircraft that moved faster than any known human technology. Lights in the sky that defied the laws of physics. He had always filed those memories away under the category of things above my pay grade. But now Jake was sitting across from him, dead serious, telling him that it was real. "They've been covering it up for decades," Jake said. "The military, the intelligence community, they've been keeping it from the public. Craft, technology, even biological material." Fred leaned forward, his hands clasped. "Biological material?" Jake nodded. Not human. Fred's breath hitched. He had faced death more times than he could count, but this was something else entirely. Why are you telling me this? Because they need people like us, Jake said. Operators with experience, tactical training, and the ability to stay calm under pressure. We've recovered things technology that we can't begin to understand. And now, they need us to protect it. Fred's mind raced. He thought back to the nights in Afghanistan, standing guard beneath a sky so dark and clear that you could see the Milky Way stretching from horizon to horizon. He remembered the strange light he had seen, once a steady white glow that had hovered for several seconds before shooting off at an impossible speed. At the time, he had convinced himself it was a satellite or a drone. Now, he wasn't so sure. They'll come after you, Fred said. If you go public with this, they'll bury you. Jake's eyes darkened. They've already tried. Fred's stomach nodded. He understood what Jake was saying without needing to hear the details. The Tier 1 community was tight-knit, loyal to a fault, but even that loyalty had limits when you were up against forces bigger than the government itself. Jake leaned across the table. We need to break the silence, Fred. People have a right to know. Fred's gaze was steady. He had spent his life following orders, serving his country, doing what needed to be done. But this was different. This wasn't about national security. This was about the truth. And Fred Baker had always believed that the truth was worth fighting for. He downed the rest of his whiskey and set the glass on the table with a quiet clink. All right, he said. I'm in. Jake's mouth curled into a faint smile. Knew I could count on you. Fred stood, his shoulders squaring as the old instincts kicked in. The mission had begun, and this time, the battlefield was far bigger than any he had faced before. Outside the cabin, the autumn air was crisp and clear. Fred took a deep breath, his eyes lifting toward the sky. Somewhere up there beyond the clouds, beyond the stars, the truth was waiting. And Fred Baker was ready to find it. The legacy of Fred Baker, a life of service and honor. Fred Baker's story begins long before his own remarkable career in the U.S. Air Force. His lineage is woven deeply into the fabric of American history, a proud thread that stretches back to the Revolutionary War. The Bakers have always answered the call to serve their country, from the battlefields under George Washington's command to the modern-day conflicts that have shaped global history. Fred Baker's journey is not just one of personal courage and achievement, but also a continuation of a legacy built on sacrifice, duty, and an unwavering sense of patriotism. Fred was born into a family where military service wasn't just a career choice, it was a tradition. His ancestor, Christopher Baker, arrived in America as an indentured servant during the British colonial era. But Christopher's story took a dramatic turn when he was forced into the British Army. Unwilling to fight for a cause he didn't believe in, Christopher deserted and joined the American revolutionaries. He fought alongside George Washington's forces, securing his place in history and planting the seeds of a proud military tradition that would span generations. Fred grew up with stories of Christopher's defiance and bravery, and they left a profound mark on him. The Bakers had fought in every major conflict in American history, from the Civil War to both World Wars, through Korea and Vietnam. Fred's father and grandfather had both served with distinction, and Fred knew from an early age that he would follow the same path. The military was not just a profession for the Bakers. It was a sacred duty passed down through blood and sacrifice. In 2000, Fred Baker enlisted in the United States Air Force, determined to honor his family's legacy. He didn't just join any unit. He sought out the most elite and demanding branch of the Air Force's Special Operations. He was accepted into the 24th Special Tactics Squadron 24th SDSA unit, so elite that it is often compared to Delta Force in the Army or SEAL Team 6 in the Navy. Fred's training was brutal. Combat controllers in the 24th SDS are tasked with some of the most dangerous and technically complex missions in the U.S. military. Their expertise lies in coordinating air-ground operations, managing air traffic in hostile environments, and directing precision airstrikes, all while operating behind enemy lines in some of the most dangerous corners of the world. Combat control requires a rare combination of technical expertise, physical endurance, and mental resilience. Many who enter the program wash out, but Fred thrived. Fred was deployed to multiple combat zones during his 20 years of service. He operated in Afghanistan and Iraq, where he directed air support in the heat of battle, called in life-saving medical evacuations under enemy fire, and coordinated complex joint operations with Navy SEALs and Army Rangers. His calm under pressure and technical precision earned him the respect of his peers and the trust of his commanders. Fred's bravery did not go unnoticed. He was awarded multiple commendations, including for Bronze Stars with Valor, an extraordinary recognition of courage and heroism in combat. Few service members ever receive even one Bronze Star with Valor. Fred earned 4, with each leaf cluster representing an additional award. He also received the Navy Presidential Unit Citation with an oak leaf cluster, a mark of collective heroism under extraordinary circumstances. But Fred's journey wasn't without its toll. He witnessed the cost of war firsthand, the lives lost, the friends buried, and the scars, both physical and emotional, that he and his fellow service members carried home. He pushed through the trauma, driven by a sense of duty that had been instilled in him since childhood. His service, however, came at a personal cost. The long deployments and the weight of responsibility took a toll on his family life. Despite the challenges, Fred never wavered in his commitment to his country and to the men and women he served alongside. After 2 decades of service, Fred retired from the Air Force in 2021 as a Master Sergeant. Leaving the military, however, was not easy for him. The transition to civilian life was jarring. For 20 years, Fred had operated under a clear mission to protect and serve. Civilian life, by comparison, felt directionless. He took a job in the private sector, but the work felt empty. He missed the camaraderie of his unit and the sense of purpose that came with his military service. Then came the call that would change the trajectory of Fred's life. Jake Barber, a fellow veteran and a figure deeply involved in the secretive world of UAP unidentified aerial phenomena investigations, reached out to Fred. Jake was assembling a team of elite former special operators to work on a classified project related to the recovery of UAP technology. The project was shrouded in secrecy, and the stakes were high. Jake needed someone he could trust, someone with the tactical skill, operational experience, and personal integrity that Fred embodied. Fred hesitated at first. He had spent his career operating within the structured environment of the military. The idea of stepping into the murky world of covert UAP investigations was unsettling. But the more Jake shared, the more intrigued Fred became. The government had been quietly collecting and studying crashed UAPs for decades. The technology was far beyond anything human engineering could produce, and Jake's team was tasked with understanding and possibly reverse engineering it. Fred saw this as more than just another mission. It was an opportunity to serve his country once again. He accepted the offer, stepping back into a world of secrecy and danger. His role in Jake's team would involve coordinating recovery missions, securing high-value assets, and providing tactical support during field operations. He was back in his element. Fred's decision to join Jake's team wasn't just about duty, it was about reclaiming a sense of purpose. His family's legacy of service had always been about protecting something greater than oneself. For generations, the Bakers had fought to protect America's values and its people. Fred saw this new mission as a continuation of that legacy, only this time, the battlefield was not just on Earth, but potentially beyond it. Fred Baker's story is not just about the medals he's earned or the missions he's completed, it's about the values that guided him through it all: courage, loyalty, and honor. His career reflects the resilience and strength that define America's military tradition. Fred's story reminds us that true service isn't just about fighting wars, it's about protecting the future and ensuring that the next generation inherits a world where truth and understanding prevail. As Fred reflects on his career and the path ahead, he remains humble about his achievements. He credits his success to the men and women who served alongside him and the legacy of those who came before him. "I'm proud of where I came from," he says. "My family fought for this country for over 2 centuries. I'm just doing my part to carry that legacy forward." In a world where so much remains uncertain, Fred Baker's story stands as a testament to the enduring spirit of American service and sacrifice. His life reminds us that heroes are not just defined by their achievements in battle, but by their unwavering commitment to duty, even when the mission extends beyond the limits of human understanding. The night that changed everything. Fred Baker wasn't the kind of man who easily bought into wild stories. His life had been shaped by discipline, structure, and years of hard training in the United States Air Force. After enlisting in 2000, he had spent the entirety of his career in special warfare, serving as a combat controller in the elite 24th Special Tactics Squadron. It was a life filled with intense pressure and high-stakes missions. Fred had seen war up close, navigating chaotic combat zones, calling in airstrikes under fire, and making split-second decisions that often meant the difference between life and death. He was trained to handle uncertainty, but nothing had prepared him for what he was about to encounter. After leaving the military, Fred retired from the Air Force in 2021, looking forward to a quieter life. But adjusting to civilian life was more difficult than he expected. After 2 decades of high-octane operations and adrenaline-fueled missions, the mundane rhythm of daily life felt empty. He tried a regular job for a while, but the transition didn't sit well with him. He missed the purpose and camaraderie of his former life. That's when he got a call from Jake Barber, a name he had heard mentioned in quiet circles of the military, but had never worked with directly. Jake was assembling a team of elite veterans for a highly classified project, and he wanted Fred to be part of it. Jake wasn't vague about the nature of the work, but what he described seemed almost too unbelievable to take seriously. "We're working on something involving non-human technology," Jake had said. Fred had heard rumors over the years, strange reports from pilots, unexplained encounters, whispers about covert recovery programs. But in the military, you learn to compartmentalize. Things you can't explain are brushed aside. The mission always comes first. Still, Jake's reputation preceded him. If Jake said it was real, Fred was willing to listen. Fred's first real taste of this hidden world came one quiet night when Jake invited him to take part in an unusual exercise. It wasn't a combat drill, nor was it a traditional training operation. "We're going to try to make contact," Jake said simply. Jake had been working closely with a man Fred only knew as an AE, an alleged expert in psionic communication. Fred wasn't sure what to expect. He had been trained to rely on cold logic, physical strength, and tactical precision, not emotional energy or spiritual connection. But the AE explained it matter-of-factly. "It's not about force," he said. "It's about intent, about emotion. You need to project positive energy, love, openness, and curiosity. That's what they respond to." Fred was skeptical, but curious enough to play along. They traveled to a remote desert location, far from any populated area, under a clear and moonless sky. The air was crisp, and the temperature had dropped to around 40 degrees Fahrenheit. The stars were brilliant against the deep black sky. It reminded Fred of the nights he had spent in Afghanistan, where the sky stretched endlessly above the barren terrain. Jake and the AE guided Fred through a meditation-like exercise, encouraging him to focus on feelings of love and openness. Fred sat on the cold ground, breathing in the desert air, trying to push aside his natural skepticism. This isn't going to work, he thought, and then it did. A pinpoint of light appeared high in the sky. At first, Fred assumed it was a satellite, a steady, silent point of light moving across the darkness. But then it stopped. It hovered for a moment, then moved in a perfect half circle before shooting off in another direction at an impossible speed. Fred sat up, his pulse quickening. "Did you see that?" he whispered. Jake and the AE nodded. "Keep going," the AE said softly. "You're making contact." Fred closed his eyes and focused on the feeling of warmth, of gratitude for being alive, of love for his family back home. When he opened his eyes, the light had returned, and this time it wasn't alone. Smaller orbs of light darted around the larger object, moving in synchronized patterns. Then, without warning, the main light descended rapidly, growing brighter as it approached. It stopped again, hanging impossibly still in the night sky, and then began to pulse. Fred could feel the vibration in his chest. It was as though the object was acknowledging him. That's when the triangle appeared. A massive triangular craft materialized silently above them, partially obscured by the darkness. It was enormous, at least the size of a football field, if not larger. 3 bright lights glowed at each corner, with a faint amber hue flickering at their edges. The craft moved slowly, gliding through the air without any visible means of propulsion. Smaller orbs swirled around it, like attendants to a king. There was no sound, not the faintest whisper of an engine or the low hum of a drone. It was as if the air itself had fallen still. Fred was frozen, his mind racing to make sense of what he was seeing. He had spent years working with cutting-edge military technology. He knew the capabilities of every aircraft in the U.S. arsenal. Nothing moved like this. Nothing could stop on a dime, reverse course, and accelerate instantaneously. He turned to Jake, wide-eyed. "How is this possible?" Jake smiled knowingly. "It's not ours." Fred's training kicked in, scanning the sky, analyzing the angles, calculating the distance, but none of it made sense. The triangle hovered for nearly a minute before tilting slightly and drifting away toward the horizon. The smaller orbs followed in its wake. And then, as quickly as they had appeared, they were gone. Was that real? Fred asked, his breath ragged. Jake placed a hand on his shoulder. "You saw it," he said simply. Fred sat in stunned silence for a long time. His mind rebelled against what he had witnessed, but his heart knew it was true. This was not human technology. This was something else, something older, more advanced, and infinitely more mysterious. He felt a strange mix of awe and calm. Whatever this was, whoever they were, they hadn't come with hostility. They had responded to love, to openness. That night marked a turning point for Fred Baker. He had spent his entire career navigating the chaos of human conflict, learning to see the world through the lens of strategy and survival. But this was different. For the first time in his life, he felt that maybe humanity wasn't alone. Maybe there was someone watching over them. Not as an enemy, but as a quiet presence, waiting for humanity to reach out. They packed up their gear and prepared to leave. Fred took one last look at the sky. The stars were quiet again, but he could feel it, an invisible presence lingering beneath the surface of reality. He didn't understand it yet, but he knew one thing for certain. The universe was bigger and more connected than he had ever imagined. And for the first time in a long time, Fred Baker felt hope. Fred Baker's secret mission, the high-stakes operation to recover the stolen Panasonic Toughbooks. Fred Baker never imagined that his years of service in the U.S. Air Force's 24th Special Tactics Squadron would lead him to a mission so dangerous and classified that even speaking about it years later would feel like walking a tightrope over a pit of secrets. For 20 years, Baker had lived a life few could understand, a combat controller embedded in the most elite circles of U.S. military operations. His job had always been to coordinate complex missions, guiding air support and special operations teams in hostile territory, often behind enemy lines. But nothing in his storied military career could have prepared him for the call he received after leaving the Air Force. It began in 2021, just months after his retirement. Fred had tried to adjust to civilian life, finding a steady job, spending time with his family, and trying to shake the adrenaline-fueled existence that had defined him for 2 decades. But the routine of everyday life never seemed to fit him quite right. He often felt like he had been trained for something more, as if his years of honing precision and discipline in combat had prepared him for a mission that hadn't yet revealed itself. That moment arrived when Jake Barber, a trusted friend and former colleague in the special operations community, reached out with an unusual proposal. "Fred, I need you," Jake said over the phone. "It's bigger than anything we've ever been a part of. And it's dangerous." Jake's tone was serious. It was the kind of tone that made Fred sit up straighter, his military instincts firing up immediately. He didn't ask for details over the phone. He didn't need to. If Jake Barber was calling him, it meant the stakes were life and death. They met in a remote location a few days later. Jake explained that classified information had been stolen from a top-secret program involving retrieval and reverse engineering of UFO technology, or UAP's unidentified aerial phenomena, as the intelligence community had begun calling them. The stolen assets weren't just files or reports. They were Panasonic Toughbooks, specialized military-grade laptops containing sensitive data about the UAP program. The theft wasn't just an embarrassment, it was a threat to national security. Whoever had stolen those Toughbooks knew exactly what they were looking for. "Our orders are simple," Jake said, leaning in. "Recover the Toughbooks. At all costs." Fred's mind was already working through the logistics. Recovering stolen hardware was one thing, but the nature of the information on those Toughbooks meant that the theft itself had likely been sanctioned or at least protected by powerful figures in the defense and intelligence communities. That meant they wouldn't just be fighting against external enemies, they'd be going up against people on the inside. Fred assembled a small team of trusted operators, men he had served with in combat, men he knew would follow him into fire and back. They started by tracking down leads through old contacts in the military and intelligence community. After several weeks of digging, they received a credible tip. The Toughbooks were being held in a secure location in the Sierra Nevada mountains. "It's heavily guarded," Jake told Fred as they went over the briefing. "But we don't have a choice." Fred's team moved under the cover of darkness, navigating the rugged mountain terrain using night vision goggles and satellite guidance. The location was nestled between jagged cliffs, accessible only through a narrow pass. Surveillance indicated that the facility was manned by private security, not military, but clearly professionals. That meant someone had hired contractors to keep the stolen assets out of government hands. Fred's team approached with surgical precision. Using suppressed weapons and coordinated signals, they neutralized the outer perimeter without raising an alarm. Moving toward the facility's interior, they encountered resistance, a group of heavily armed guards who responded with alarming speed and accuracy. Fred knew immediately that these weren't ordinary contractors, these were Tier 1 operators, the kind of men who had been trained by the same programs Fred and Jake had come from. "They knew we were coming," Fred muttered to Jake over the comms inside the facility. They found a locked server room where the Toughbooks were supposed to be stored. Jake worked the keypad, bypassing the security protocols while Fred and the others covered the doors. Moments before Jake cracked the code, a flashbang exploded in the corridor, blinding Fred and sending his ears ringing. He recovered quickly, returning fire down the hall as figures in tactical gear advanced on them. "They're here to clean this up," Jake shouted. Fred's team pushed back hard, holding their ground long enough for Jake to breach the room. Inside, 2 tough books sat on a metal table beneath red emergency lighting. Jake stuffed them into a tactical backpack and handed it to Fred. "Go," Jake barked. They fought their way out, weaving through gunfire as they escaped down the rocky pass. 2 team members were hit, but still mobile, adrenaline and training keeping them on their feet. Just as they reached the extraction point, a helicopter appeared on the horizon, not their extraction chopper, but a black, unmarked craft with no identifying marks. "Incoming," one of the team members shouted. Fred raised his rifle, but the chopper didn't fire. It hovered for a moment, as if observing them. Then it turned and disappeared into the night. Back at the safe house, Jake secured the tough books and began assessing their contents. What he found confirmed their worst suspicions. The files contained not just technical data on UAP recovery, they included detailed psychological and physiological profiles of individuals who had reportedly made direct contact with UAP technology. Even more disturbing, the files indicated that some individuals had been subjected to classified experiments aimed at enhancing their ability to communicate with non-human technology. "It's real," Jake whispered, staring at the screen. "It's all real." Fred sat down heavily, the weight of the mission settling in his chest. They had recovered the data, but the implications were staggering. Someone or some group within the highest levels of government and private industry was running a program to harness non-human technology and control the narrative around UAP encounters. The stolen tough books had been a threat not because of what they contained, but because of what they proved. "What do we do now?" Fred asked. Jake smiled faintly. "We tell the truth." Fred leaned back, rubbing his hands over his face. He had spent his life protecting classified information, operating in the shadows to safeguard national security. But now, for the first time in his career, he realized that the greatest threat to security wasn't coming from outside forces, it was coming from within. As Fred watched Jake begin the process of decoding the files, he knew that the hardest part of the mission was still ahead. Recovering the tough books had been dangerous, but exposing the truth would be even more perilous. Fred had faced gunfire, insurgents, and enemy combatants throughout his career. But now he was about to take on a battle unlike any he had ever fought, a battle for the truth. The power of the mind, a veteran's journey into psionic connection. Fred Baker had always been a man of discipline and action. After 2 decades of service in the U.S. Air Force's 24th Special Tactics Squadron, he had learned to rely on his training, instincts, and physical strength. Combat control was his life. High-stakes missions, tactical decisions under fire, and the weight of lives depending on his expertise. But nothing in his years of military training could have prepared him for the night. He stood under the open sky and faced the impossible. It started shortly after Fred left the military in 2021. Like many veterans, adjusting to civilian life wasn't easy. He found himself restless, feeling as though his skills were being wasted. That's when he got the call from Jake Barber, a man he had come to know and respect. Jake wasn't just another soldier. He was involved in something much bigger, something Fred couldn't have imagined in his wildest dreams. Jake told him about a program that dealt with unidentified aerial phenomena, UAP, the modern term for UFOs, and hinted at something even more extraordinary: the ability to interact with these phenomena using the mind. At first, Fred was skeptical. He had spent his career grounded in the tangible equipment, strategy, and hard facts. The idea of engaging with alien technology using emotions and thoughts seemed more like science fiction than reality. But Jake was insistent. He wasn't trying to convince Fred with wild stories or conspiracy theories. He was inviting him to see it for himself. Fred agreed to meet with a man Jake referred to as a psionic assistant. This individual claimed to have the ability to call these craft using focused mental energy and positive emotional projection. "All you have to do is project love," the man told Fred. They respond to that. Fred nearly laughed. A combat-hardened special operator was being told that the key to interacting with advanced extraterrestrial technology was love? It was absurd, but curiosity got the better of him. One crisp evening, Fred found himself standing in an open field with a psionic assistant, looking up at a star-filled sky. It was cold, probably around 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and the air was still. The psionic assistant began guiding Fred through the process. "Clear your mind," he said. "Focus on the feeling of love. Not on a person or a memory, just the pure energy of love." Fred closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He thought about his wife, his kids, the men he had served with, and the sacrifices they had made for each other. He felt a warmth begin to build in his chest, a quiet sense of connection. And then something happened. A light appeared in the sky. At first, Fred thought it was a satellite, moving slowly and steadily. But then it stopped. Satellites don't stop. The light hovered for a moment, then performed a sharp half-circle maneuver and shot off at incredible speed. His eyes widened. "Did you see that?" Fred asked. "That's just the beginning," the psionic assistant replied. "Keep going." Fred focused again, this time more intentional with his feelings. He reached deeper into himself, allowing the warmth to grow stronger. Suddenly, the sky above him came alive. A massive triangular craft appeared, gliding silently through the night. It was enormous, easily the size of a football field, maybe larger. Its 3 points glowed with a soft white-orange light, and smaller orb-like objects seemed to orbit it, trailing behind it like fireflies. Fred's mouth hung open. He was trained to identify aircraft. He knew the capabilities of U.S. technology better than most, but this was unlike anything he had ever seen. There was no sound, no visible propulsion system, and the way it moved, smooth, deliberate, and almost playful, was beyond human engineering. He turned to the psionic assistant, who was smiling. "They know you're here," the man said. "They feel you." For the first time in his life, Fred felt completely out of his depth. He wasn't sure if it was fear or awe, but his heart was racing. "What are they?" he asked. "They're not human," the man replied. "But they're not hostile. They're just aware." Fred stood frozen, watching the massive triangle drift across the sky. The smaller orbs seemed to dance around it, moving with a fluidity that defied physics. It wasn't just technology, there was intelligence behind it. After what felt like minutes, the triangle began to ascend. The orbs followed, and within seconds, the entire formation disappeared into the night sky. Fred stood in silence, his breath visible in the cold air. What just happened?" he finally asked. "You connected," the psionic assistant said. And they responded. That night changed Fred. He had spent his life in the service of his country, defending its interests and protecting its people. He had seen the worst of humanity: conflict, destruction, and death. But this was something different. It wasn't about war or survival, it was about connection. Fred began training with the psionic assistant and Jake's team. The goal was to refine their ability to interact with these phenomena, not through weapons or technology, but through consciousness. "It's about energy," Jake explained to him once. "They operate on a different frequency. When we project love and openness, they respond." That's the key. Fred struggled with that concept. Love wasn't a word that came naturally to a man shaped by war and conflict. But the more he practiced, the more he began to understand. The connection wasn't just about reaching out to the craft. It was about rediscovering a part of himself that had been buried under years of training and survival. One evening, after a particularly successful session, Fred sat with Jake by a fire. "Do you think this is why they've kept it secret?" Fred asked. Jake nodded. "It changes everything. If people knew they could connect with these things, if they understood that love and consciousness were the keys to that connection, it would rewrite our understanding of the universe. And it would make a lot of powerful people obsolete." Fred thought about his children. The world they were growing up in was one built on division and conflict. But what if it didn't have to be that way? What if humanity's next great evolution wasn't technological, but spiritual? "If this gets out," Fred said, "there's no going back." Jake smiled. "That's the idea." Fred leaned back and looked up at the night sky. The stars seemed brighter somehow. He wasn't sure what lay ahead, but for the first time in a long time, he felt something more than duty or obligation. He felt hope. Title: Finding Humanity Through the Unknown. Fred Baker sat quietly in his dimly lit living room, the soft hum of the ceiling fan blending with the distant sounds of the night outside. He had seen combat. He had faced life and death countless times as a special operator in the U.S. Air Force. But nothing in his years of training and service had prepared him for what he had experienced after leaving the military, a connection to something so profound, so otherworldly, that it reshaped his entire understanding of existence. It started with Jake Barber. Fred had always admired Jake, a man of integrity, sharp instincts, and the kind of tactical mind that could out-think even the most complex military operations. When Jake reached out to Fred after his retirement from the Air Force, Fred was at a crossroads. Civilian life wasn't working out. He felt like a part of him was missing. The camaraderie, the adrenaline, the sense of purpose, it was all gone. But when Jake called, it wasn't about getting back into the fight. It was about something bigger. Jake was part of a team investigating unidentified aerial phenomena, UAPs, what most people call UFOs. At first, Fred was skeptical. After all, he'd spent his career working with some of the most advanced technology known to man. He knew the capabilities of American aircraft and intelligence systems inside and out. If something was flying around that wasn't one of ours, Fred figured he'd have heard about it. But Jake was insistent. There was more going on beneath the surface, and he needed Fred's expertise. Fred's first real encounter with the unknown didn't happen in the field or during a military operation. It happened in a quiet, open field under the stars. Jake introduced Fred to a man who claimed to have the ability to communicate with these craft through something called psionic energy, a form of mental and emotional connection. The man explained that by projecting love and positive emotion, the craft could be summoned. Fred couldn't help but laugh. Love? Emotional projection? He had spent his life controlling chaos through precision and discipline. Love had nothing to do with warfare, but that night, Fred decided to give it a shot. He stood in the open field, the chill of the night air biting at his skin, and focused. He thought about his children, how much he wanted them to grow up in a better world. He thought about his wife, the nights spent apart during deployments, the fear in her eyes when he left for another mission. He let himself feel the gratitude and love that he had held back for years, the emotions he had locked away behind layers of military conditioning. And then, it happened. A bright light appeared high in the sky, moving steadily at first, then stopping in midair. Fred's heart raced. His training told him this was impossible. There was no known aircraft capable of such sudden stops. The light flickered, then traced a perfect half circle in the sky before shooting off at an impossible speed. Fred stood frozen, his breath catching in his throat. But that wasn't the end. Moments later, a massive triangle-shaped craft appeared overhead. Its size was staggering, easily the length of a football field or more. Its edges were lined with glowing white lights, tinged with soft orange hues. Smaller orbs floated around the craft, darting through the sky with precision and speed no human-made technology could match. The triangle glided silently, with no sound of engines or thrusters. The sheer size and silence of it filled Fred with awe and a strange sense of peace. He turned to the man beside him. How? How is this happening? Fred whispered. The man smiled. You reached them. Fred couldn't comprehend it. How could a machine, if that's even what it was, respond to something as intangible as emotion? He had spent his life solving problems with logic and strategy, but this was beyond anything tactical or technical. It wasn't about force or control, it was about connection. In the days that followed, Fred became more involved with Jake's work. They weren't just observing these phenomena, they were trying to understand the deeper implications. What did it mean that human emotion could communicate with something not of this earth? Was humanity capable of more than just physical interaction with the universe? Fred started to reflect on his years in the military. He had always been taught that war was necessary, that there were enemies who needed to be fought and defeated. But now he started to see things differently. If love could bridge the gap between humans and extraterrestrial intelligence, maybe love could also heal the divisions on Earth. He remembered the countless missions where he had fought not out of hatred for the enemy, but out of love for his brothers in arms, the men who stood beside him in the most dangerous corners of the world. Maybe that was the key all along. Not fighting out of hatred, but protecting out of love. One night, Fred had a conversation with Jake about the spiritual side of this connection. Jake admitted that it had changed him, that he had grown more patient, more compassionate, more centered. Fred understood. The act of opening himself up to love and connection, rather than force and control, had begun to reshape him too, but it wasn't all easy. Some people within the military and intelligence community viewed these experiences as dangerous, possibly even demonic. Fred's own religious friends warned him that this was dark territory, that opening himself to unknown forces could expose him to spiritual danger. Fred considered it carefully. He had always been a man of faith, but he couldn't reconcile the fear and suspicion with the peace and connection he had felt under that night sky. I don't think it's evil, Fred told Jake one day. It doesn't feel like that. It feels right. Like we're remembering something we lost. Jake nodded. Maybe we are. Fred began to think more about the future, not just his own, but his children's. If humanity could learn to connect with these beings, if they could harness the same emotional energy that summoned the triangle in the sky, what else could they unlock? A world without war, without hunger, without fear? I don't want my kids to grow up in a world where they have to fight, Fred told Jake. I want them to grow up knowing there's something greater out there, something peaceful. Jake smiled. Maybe that's what this is about. Teaching us that we don't have to fight anymore. Fred still didn't have all the answers. He wasn't even sure what questions to ask. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't searching for control or strategy. He was searching for connection. He was learning that strength didn't come from dominance, it came from vulnerability. And maybe, just maybe, the key to humanity's next chapter wasn't in weapons or technology, but in something far simpler: love. Fred knew this wasn't going to be easy. Change never is. But for the first time in his life, he felt like he was fighting for something more than survival. He was fighting for a future where humanity didn't have to fight at all, and that was a battle worth winning. Title: The Government's Secret. What are they hiding about UFOs? Fred Baker sat across from the interviewer, his sharp blue eyes scanning the room. A man who had spent over 2 decades in the United States Air Force, he was not one to be easily rattled. He had served in the 24th Special Tactics Squadron, one of the most elite Tier 1 units in the Air Force Special Operations Command. He had been in life or death situations more times than he could count. Yet, as he began to speak about what he had seen and experienced in the last few years, there was a weight in his voice, a tension that suggested he was walking a fine line between courage and fear. "It's not the aliens that scare me," he said, leaning forward. His hands clasped tightly together. "It's the people trying to keep it quiet." Fred was referring to the intelligence community and elements within the military-industrial complex, people with enormous power and influence who had been working relentlessly to bury the truth about unidentified aerial phenomena, UAP, and extraterrestrial contact. What started as a quiet mission to recover stolen equipment had spiraled into something much darker and more dangerous. The recovery mission that changed everything. It all began with a call from Jake Barber, a trusted figure within the Special Operations community. Jake had uncovered evidence that 2 Panasonic Toughbooks rugged military-grade laptops had been stolen from a highly classified program connected to UAP retrieval and reverse engineering. These laptops, Fred explained, contained sensitive data that could expose the truth about decades of government research into extraterrestrial technology. Fred was tasked with helping locate and recover these devices. He had operated in some of the most dangerous environments on Earth: Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, but this mission was different. The threat didn't come from insurgents or hostile nations. It came from within. After tracking down leads and conducting surveillance, Fred and his team successfully recovered the 2 laptops from a secure location deep in the Sierra Nevada mountains. It should have been a routine success story. But as they were leaving the area, Fred began to feel that something was off. Vehicles followed them at a distance. Communications were disrupted. Jake, normally calm under pressure, was visibly on edge. That night, Fred received a secure message from one of his intelligence contacts. "You've been compromised. Get out now." Fred and his team immediately went dark, changing vehicles and routes multiple times to shake off any potential tail. But the damage was already done. Somehow, someone high up in the chain of command had learned about their mission and wasn't happy about it. They wanted those laptops recovered, Fred said, but they didn't want us asking questions about what was on them. A deadly setup. The following week, Fred and Jake were called to a private meeting with the director of security for a major defense contractor, a company deeply tied to the government's UAP research programs. They were told to meet in a remote location on the outskirts of a military testing range. The setup was suspicious from the beginning. Fred and Jake arrived at the location, carefully surveying their surroundings. 2 black SUVs were parked near the entrance, but no one was in sight. Their instincts kicked in. Fred noticed faint footprints in the dirt, leading toward a nearby Ridge military boots. Someone was already there watching. Suddenly, Jake's encrypted phone buzzed. A single word flashed across the screen. "Abort." Fred immediately signaled to Jake, and they began to back away toward their vehicle. That's when they heard a distinct metallic click, followed by the unmistakable sound of a round being chambered into a rifle. "Go," Fred shouted, pulling Jake behind cover. Shots rang out, striking the gravel near their feet. They returned fire and moved toward their vehicle. Within seconds, the black SUVs roared to life and sped toward them. Fred fired a warning shot, shattering the windshield of one SUV, forcing it to veer off course. They managed to escape, but the message was clear. They had crossed a line. "The fact that they were willing to take us out," Fred said, "means that we were too close to something they didn't want us to see," the disinformation campaign. In the days that followed, Fred and Jake found themselves under intense scrutiny. Their social media accounts were hacked. False accusations began appearing in defense circles, claims that Fred had falsified his military record, that Jake had mental health issues. Anonymous sources within the intelligence community fed these rumors to friendly reporters, aiming to discredit them. Fred wasn't surprised. He had seen this kind of campaign before. It's straight out of the playbook, he said. Create doubt. Undermine credibility. Make people question what they're hearing. But this time, the smear campaign wasn't just about protecting classified information. It was about keeping the public in the dark about the very existence of non-human intelligence. They don't care if people know about UFOs, Fred explained. What they care about is losing control of the narrative. If people realize that there's technology out there that could change everything, free energy, anti-gravity propulsion, medical breakthroughs, they'd start asking why we've been kept in the dark for so long. Fred believes that elements within the intelligence community, defense contractors, and even private aerospace companies have been working together to maintain control over this information for decades. It's not about national security anymore, he said. It's about power, control, and money, a threat from within. Fred is convinced that there are factions within the government that would rather see whistleblowers dead than allow them to speak publicly. There's a reason why so many of these guys are scared to talk, Fred said. People have disappeared over this stuff. Car accidents that don't make sense. Heart attacks in healthy guys. It's not paranoia if it's real. He recounted how Jake had been approached by a high-ranking defense official who warned him to stay in his lane. Days later, Jake's car was nearly forced off the road by an unmarked vehicle. They want to intimidate you, Fred said. Make you think twice before you say too much, but Fred and Jake have refused to back down. People deserve to know the truth, Fred said. They deserve to know that they're not alone. Why keep it secret? Fred believes that the secrecy is rooted in the threat to the existing order. If advanced extraterrestrial technology were made public, the implications would be staggering. Imagine a world where you don't need fossil fuels, Fred said, where energy is free, where diseases can be cured with advanced medicine. That would wipe out entire industries overnight. He shook his head. It's not about aliens. It's about control. If the public knows the truth, the whole system collapses. Fred knows that speaking out puts him at risk. He's had to take precautions, changing his daily routine, securing his communications, and even training his family on how to respond if they're approached. But he's not backing down. They can try to discredit us, he said, but the truth has a way of coming out. Fred leaned back in his chair, his expression calm but resolute. We've spent too long letting them control the narrative. It's time for the people to know the truth. And with that, Fred Baker stood up, adjusted his jacket, and walked out of the room. The weight of what he had revealed still hung in the air, a secret too big to keep forever. A glimpse into the future, hope for humanity. Fred Baker sat on his back porch, the evening sun casting a soft amber glow over the fields beyond his modest home. The air was cool, and the faint sound of crickets echoed from the tall grass. He sat with a quiet stillness, the kind that only comes after years of both physical and emotional battles. The scars he carried weren't just on his body, they were etched into his mind and heart, remnants of a life spent in service to his country, and more recently, in search of answers to questions humanity had avoided for too long. It wasn't the combat missions or the classified operations that haunted him the most. No, it was the knowledge, the undeniable truth that everything humanity had been taught about its place in the universe was, at best, incomplete. He had seen things that defied explanation, touched truths that had the potential to upend centuries of human understanding. And yet, despite the enormity of it all, it was the simplest realization that weighed on him the most. Love was the key. Fred took a slow sip of his coffee, the warmth spreading through his hands. His gaze drifted upward toward the darkening sky, where the first stars of the evening began to pierce the twilight. Somewhere out there, he knew, was life intelligent, life watching, waiting, maybe even guiding. He had seen it with his own eyes. And more profoundly, he had felt it with his own heart. He remembered the first time he had witnessed the impossible. The triangular craft, hundreds of feet across, drifting silently above him with an otherworldly grace. The orbs that danced around it like playful children. It wasn't just the sight that shook him, it was the feeling. A warmth. A sense of connection. It was as if the craft wasn't just a machine, but a conscious being, and it knew he was there. It responded to him. Jake Barber had been the one who led him down this path. Fred had trusted Jake from the beginning, not just because of his background or his training, but because Jake carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who knew he was standing at the edge of a great revelation. It was Jake who had first told him about the idea of psionic connection, the notion that human consciousness itself might be the bridge to understanding these advanced technologies and intelligence. At first, Fred had been skeptical. He was a man of action, trained in the hard realities of warfare and survival. The idea that emotion, that love could be a tool for communication with an advanced alien intelligence seemed ridiculous. But the evidence was overwhelming. He had seen it with his own eyes and felt it in his soul. He thought back to that night in the desert, under the crisp, starry sky. Jake's instructions had been simple, but strange. Project Love. Open yourself. Let go of fear and cynicism and approach with trust and vulnerability. It had gone against every instinct Fred had cultivated in his military career to be guarded, calculating, and strategic. But he tried. He forced himself to drop the emotional armor he had carried for decades, and then it happened. The triangle appeared, drifting silently above them. The orbs flitted around it in perfect synchronization, responding to the energy in the air. It was not aggression or dominance that called them, it was openness. Vulnerability. Fred had spent his life surviving through strength, but now he was discovering that the greatest strength of all was openness. Fred sighed and set down his coffee. His 2 kids were inside, laughing as they played a video game together. He smiled. His service had been for them every mission, every deployment, every sacrifice. But now he realized that there was a greater gift. He could give them a future free from the endless cycles of conflict and scarcity that had defined human history. He thought about the secrecy, the cover-ups, the disinformation, the quiet threats from those in power who didn't want the truth to emerge. The fact that humanity was not alone, that it had never been alone, had been hidden from the public for decades. Perhaps it was out of fear, or perhaps it was because those in power knew that such knowledge would empower the people in ways that could not be controlled. But Fred knew better. He had seen firsthand what could happen when people faced the truth with open hearts. This wasn't just about technology or power, it was about consciousness. Human beings had been conditioned to believe they were weak, limited by their biology and their fragile place in the cosmos. But what if that was never true? What if the ability to connect with higher intelligence had always been within them? Fred had seen what was possible. He had witnessed human consciousness sync with advanced technology, mind and machine becoming one. He had watched men and women, through simple intention and emotional resonance, call forth objects from the sky. It wasn't magic, it was the untapped potential of human consciousness. He rose from his chair and stretched, looking up at the dark sky once more. He could still feel it, that hum beneath the surface of reality, the quiet invitation to reach out and connect. Maybe the greatest tragedy of human history was that humanity had forgotten how to listen. Fred walked into the house and saw his kids sitting on the floor, focused intently on the game in front of them. He knelt down, brushing his hand over his daughter's head. She smiled up at him. "Dad, can you play with us?" She asked, "Of course," he said, sitting down beside her. As he picked up the controller, he realized that this was the gift, the real legacy. It wasn't just about revealing the existence of extraterrestrial intelligence, or even about harnessing new technology. It was about teaching the next generation that their greatest power wasn't in weapons or technology, it was in their minds and their hearts. Someday, his children would grow up knowing the truth that humanity was part of a larger cosmic family. They would understand that connection, not conflict, was the path forward. And they wouldn't approach the universe with fear, but with openness and trust. Fred smiled as the game started, the colorful characters racing across the screen. His daughter laughed when he made a wrong turn, and he laughed too. They would figure this out. Humanity would figure this out. Because now they had the key, love, and this time they wouldn't let fear get in the way.